Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Atul Nishar, President TiE Mumbai. I extend a warm welcome to each one of you to today's online seminar, 204th, 204th since 18th March. Over this period, when physical meetings were not possible, we at TiE Mumbai ensured that not only that we remain connected with all our members in a large network of 20,000 companies and individuals, but we also continue to guide the startups during this challenging time, address their queries, get the best of speakers to talk to you all, and also to impart knowledge on new trends, new happenings in India and worldwide. We have also been conducting various classes on different subjects, what we call TiE Academy. And again, through that, ensuring that our members get trained to face the new situation in a better and a stronger manner. Our members had plenty of queries regarding the cost control, how to survive, how to grow, what to do during this phase. And we had the best of experts who have talked to you in past, including Dhanpal Jhaveri, who will be in a conversation as a fireside chat with Karan Bhagat today. So again, once again, I welcome you all and appreciate your joining us and continuing to remain involved in the activities of TiE Mumbai. Please continue to do that. We'll keep coming up with new activities to ensure that we are able to give you a lot more value on an ongoing basis. And today, TiE Mumbai, as a result of all this, has emerged as a leading force, not just in India, but globally in the startup sector, the startup industry, in terms of being able to impart the latest knowledge. So coming to today's program, we have a very outstanding entrepreneur, professional, a friend to me, and also an advisor to my own family office, Karan Bhagat, the founder, managing director, and CEO of IIFL Wealth and Asset Management. So I'll briefly introduce Karan, and then I'll come to introducing my another friend, Dhanpal Jhaveri, with whom we work together at TiE. Karan Bhagat is the founder, MD, CEO of IIFL Wealth and Asset Management. He joined the IIFL Holdings Limited to found IIFL Wealth and Asset Management in 2008. During this brief period of 11 years, today IIFL Wealth manages over $25 billion of client assets. That is something like 1,70,000 odd crore. I'm sorry if I'm missing out some zeros, Karan. So that's, I mean, to me, I thought anything beyond 1 lakh was difficult to count in terms of asset management. And that is the interesting part. The Dhanpal is going to understand from Karan, how does he manage all that and how is he doing all that? How he built this outstanding company, IIFL Wealth, absolute outstanding performance that they have done. They've got listed again in a short period of time. Talking a little more about Karan, he's featured in Fortune India's under 40 list in 2016, 2017. I still find him looking below 40, but not sure now. The Economic Times, again, under 40 list in 2007 or 17. He's received the URS Asia One Global Indian of the Year award in 2018. Karan is an MBA Finance from IIM Bangalore and also done bachelor's from St. Xavier's College at Kolkata. Karan is not only it's about him, but he's also built an outstanding organization which is committed to same philosophy, vision, mission, and value system that he brought to the table. And this whole team is today able to think the way he is able to think. And that is again what we would want Dhanpal to understand for the benefit of all of us from him as to how he has managed building such an outstanding team and how does he motivate them. Coming to my second friend today here, Dhanpal Jhaveri, we work together in various organizations. TiE Mumbai, of course, I followed his footsteps. He has been president earlier um, and very successfully managed TiE Mumbai. Dhanpal is the vice chairman of Everstone Group and also CEO of Eversource Capital, India's leading climate fund focused on investments in renewable energy, e-mobility, energy storage, waste management, and water. He is very passionate about investing as well as environment. His more than 25 years of investing experience as also in corporate finance and in strategy. He also mentors young business leaders and entrepreneurs, and that's how he has been making a tremendous contribution to the entire ecosystem of startups in and around Mumbai city. But of course, his role goes beyond Mumbai. But again, coming to TiE Mumbai, I'm talking from our angle. He's been our past president at TiE Mumbai and also continuing to remain active now as the past president. He's on the board of Indian Merchants Chamber. He's also on the Committee of Climate Change at CII, and he's on the board of Avasra Leadership Academy, where again we are together, which aims to cultivate India's next generation of women leaders. I also see Pradeep Udas here. He's also same way connected with Avasra. In fact, he's got me involved in Avasra on the board, and I'm very happy about it. Pradeep is another past president of TiE Mumbai. So again, a warm welcome to both of you, Dhanpal and Karan. And once again, thanks, Karan, for your time and for joining us. Not only that all of us today who joined, but I personally as well, very keen to hear your life story and want to see how best Dhanpal is able to get out of you all that you've done and how you've gone about. Over to you, Dhanpal.
Thank you very much, Atul, first of all, for your kind words and for leading this. I'll straight away jump into this, and the way I want to kind of break up this conversation is really to first explore Karan's entrepreneurial journey, then to basically explore his role as a leader, especially in these very challenging times that we're all dealing with, and then finally some aspects of his personal life, both from an investing perspective as well as from a I know he's a young father, he's got two very bright kids, and I'd like to explore some of those angles also, because I think today in these very, very trying times, especially when most of us have been home for the last 6-7 months, I think we've all recognized both the joys and frustrations of being with family. I can hear both sides of that argument now being played out very, very loudly. But the beauty is that in some ways, these 6 months have also allowed a lot of us to reflect on what really is meaningful and what matters to all of us and who matters to all of us. So with that, maybe Karan, again, this is kind of, almost like a closed door event, because this is not something that we're keeping it open to media, etc. So we'd like you to be as candid and open in your responses. The idea is not to judge you, but the idea is to learn and to kind of for you to share your thoughts. And to start with, right, you've, in some ways, if I might say, you've been a Marwari boy who grew up in Calcutta. And it seems from your early journeys that you started a travel company that you already had some sort of an entrepreneurial bug in you. But you've also seen some failures, right? That your family business had its own challenges. You decided to do something else in life, like I wouldn't say like a good Marwadi boy, but unlike a good Marwadi boy, you first decided to get some education. And then obviously you've had a pretty, I would get to the post-education part, but maybe your early days, can you just share what was it like, and this was, I guess, a fairly long time ago, 25, 30 years ago.
Thanks a lot, Dhanpal. Thanks a lot, Mr. Nishar, for all those kind words. I'm hoping I'm going to do justice to all your words over the next 10, 15 years as we go along. But, we keep learning as we go along. And Dhanpal, it's a great question, actually. I kind of grew up in Cal, was lucky and unlucky to be in an all-boys college called St. Xavier's in Calcutta. I'm saying unlucky because we had to be in college at 6 in the morning with another 800 boys around, and we somehow made it to college at 6:30. Lucky because college got over at 8:45 in the morning. So essentially it was 6 o'clock to 8:45, and as was the culture in Calcutta, supposed to go down to your dad's office and get down to doing some work and give your CA exams after a couple of years and kind of get down to doing your own business. As life was to have it, I think my dad was on the fabrication part of the business. 97, the entire Asian crisis caused a massive depreciation in the Asian currencies and effectively ended up causing a massive chain reaction in terms of payments getting defaulted. And that's what really got me to start a business. I ended up taking capital from one of the large traders, cable traders in a street called Ezra Street in Calcutta. And if any of you have been to Cal, it's one of the toughest streets to do business because it needs you to negotiate pretty much every second, every rupee, every paisa. And we started out with 10 lakhs of capital or 5 lakhs of capital. The first 18% interest belonged to him. Then my 5,000 rupees salary, and then it was a 50-50 joint venture from there. So the first 2 years starting out a travel agency was a phenomenal experience because those days you could still sit with the banker and have a cigarette smoke and potentially get your check cleared for the first 2-3 days and run an overdraft account for 24 hours, 48 hours. But in some ways, those 2 years taught me all the commercial aspects of doing a business. And I think that learning process, both in terms of selling and both in terms of kind of trying to start a business, was impeccable and something I can never forget. Going to every Ezra Street trader or even a large corporate, business was very simple. You either gave him a 2-month credit or you gave a upfront 4% cash discount. So the margin was 5, cost of money was 2% a month. If he's paying you upfront, you give him a 4% discount. If he's not paying you upfront, you need to give him a 2-month credit. And doing business in those circumstances is really difficult. Enjoyed a lot, learned a lot, but after 24 months, figured out capital is going to be the key. And if you don't have capital, really, you're not going to be able to scale up the business. Getting capital was next to impossible as a college student back in '98. And honestly, that's when I turned to education. It wasn't out of choice or out of the love of learning. But looked around and figured out, was lucky to be bright, but looked around and figured out IIMs are the shortest cut to corporate India. And for whatever reason it was, and now I think about it even more after having studied there for 2 years. But you cut through at least the first 3-4 chains of the corporate ladder and suddenly join at level 5 if you're from an IIM. So got lucky, studied hard that year, 99, got into IIM Bangalore. And I had a great 2 years there.
Okay, let's not get ahead. I want to kind of continue to explore some stuff around that, right? So this is great. So you obviously had what I would call an entrepreneurial kind of a moment, went through it, spent 2 years, and they're pretty valuable years, right? Because when I guess you must be all of 20 or something like that, or 18 when you set up this business,
18,
right?
18,
and at 18, I remember my life, right? I used to think of every month as a year, right? Because we all wanted to kind of grow super fast. It's now that we look back, 20 years behind us and we say, okay, boss, life is not all about trying to be hyper fast, right? But this move that you had to make, in which you make it sound very easy that you just got into IIMB, right? Because IIMB is not an easy place. So, again, and it's not like you came from a family where everyone was following a kind of a professional career. So what happened? And, are you just basically a smart guy, or did you wing your way, or you did some jugaad, or what?
If I look back, it was not out of choice. It was the only option available, right? And if I was to look across my extended family, even today, the only person who's not in business is me, even today. So I think everybody is both from an extended family as well as the immediate family. Everybody is in business, so that was the natural path to go. Yeah, I just kind of got a little. I wasn't enjoying it in the sense being in that bubble called Calcutta, and I think it just wanted to get out. And the only way of doing that was getting smart education. And as I said, we're always bright, so that we had to work hard, but thankfully was on the brighter side of things. And while we had to work hard, I think it wasn't impossible to get through. So it was my first attempt. We worked hard at it and got in. So I don't know if I was smart, but I think that I honestly looked at that as the easiest possible option.
Okay, so you get into IMB, you do your 2 years over there, you have a great time, you work hard, and then it's not like success suddenly begetted you, right? When you got out, you had your own fair of challenges. Why don't you talk through that?
So IIM Bangalore itself was so it's been a great story for me. But so I got into IIM Bangalore, and to be honest, met these strange people from Delhi and Bombay, for the lack of a better word. All of us from Calcutta were not even remotely socially mobile in that sense. The IIMs had a lot of people from SRCC, LSR, and all the colleges in Bombay. We really had to work hard to just kind of keep up with them in terms of the typing speed. We not really got exposed to computers back in Cal, and it was as basic as that. We had a great time doing an exchange program in Spain, and I think that really helped. And honestly, if I look back to IMB, the 2 years for me really was about exposure to peers and learning from them, as opposed to really going through the books and the notes. And honestly, all what I remember there is how we could kind of interact with each other. Graduated in 2001, only with one thought: will not go back to selling again to individual clients and traders ever again. Don't want to be a salesman. And if at all want to be a consultant and investment banker, did that for the 2 years of my life. Don't want to do that again. And Destiny obviously has its own course. Went to Spain to do an exchange program, got placed there in a company called Cluster Consulting, which was like the McKinsey equivalent, but kind of specializing in telecom and financial services. Came back, we had one of the best placement years possible. 2001 was a boom year, and opted out of the placements. I had a PPO from HSBC, which I didn't take, and because I had already got this offer from Cluster. Got out of campus with a heady feeling, a lot of stock options in Cluster. And unfortunately, the visa kept taking longer and longer because it required a residency permit in Spain. Got lucky again. I was spending time in Cal. Needed the money, started teaching in an educational institute called Erudite for MBA aspirants. So started teaching maths and English for around about 8 hours, 10 hours a day. Helped him design the course. And that's why I ended up meeting my wife. So she was studying there as an MBA aspirant. In that sense, it was 4 months well spent. But during one of the classes, as I was teaching, September 11th happened. And little did I know that it's going to change life in many ways. Till September 11th, I never looked at the Sensex, never looked at the index, have a natural inclination to the stock market, never knew I'm going to be in the markets. September 11th, 2001 is pretty much the first time I heard there's something called the index, which is kind of crashing. And exactly 10 days from there, Cluster kind of called me saying that, we need to kind of push out your offer. And things in Europe really went very, very bad for telecom. And exactly 10 days from there, Cluster kind of got merged into a company called Diamond Technology Partners. And they pretty much called me and said, you take 6 months of pay, and called out the offer. 2001 November became a real challenging time to get a job. Accenture, I2, Infosys, everybody backed out of their offers from campus. And I was back again more or less in November of 01, 5% of the batch outside without jobs. And we kind of started searching for jobs all over again, and became really, really difficult to get anything. Managed to get 2 offers after a lot of dog work. One from Kotak Securities and the other from ICICI. Both were the lowest paying jobs in campus in that year. In fact, Kotak never got to come to campus that year. So it was a day 3 company, and jobs got over on day 2. But somehow managed to get into Kotak Securities. and ended up doing exactly what I had planned not to do, doing cold calling and reaching out to clients to manage money. The only thing I didn't want to do it was in Calcutta, so that I really pushed hard. I didn't want to go back to all my family, relatives, and Ezra Street all over again, hunting for money. So fortunately, ended up being in Delhi.
So as we fast forward now, right? You're doing well in Kotak. You spend a few years over there. You're getting promoted. 2007, right? And you kind of quite well settled. I mean, in Kotak, you actually got the position of the head of wealth business. So when did this whole entrepreneurial bug, was it always there, or it suddenly kind of triggered that you could do something different, you could do something better, or you wanted to do something yourself? And take us through that whole, and there are two questions I have over there, right? You chose two things. One is you chose a corporate partnership as an entrepreneur, and two, you chose a bunch of co-founders, right? And if you look at the entrepreneur's journey, these are kind of, I would say, the capital and the founding team are the two of the most important ingredients. If you can reflect on that and just give us a perspective over there.
No, so I think the second question is very deep. So I'll start off with the first one and then try and answer the second one. But the first one, obviously, I think life moved very fast. As a management trainee in Kotak, you had practically zero exposure. But broadly, in a very, very small nutshell, the way all organizations work, 15 to 20% of the revenue to get the firm effectively becomes your compensation in some way or the other, whether it comes through salaries or bonuses or whatever. I think we're very happy with that, 15 to 20%, because you still, kind of could take your holidays, could go for offsites. And even if you went out on your own, more often than not, you would end up doing less than 20% of the revenues you would do sitting inside the corporate. So if I was sitting in Kotak doing 100 rupees of revenue, getting paid 20 rupees, if I went out, most probably my revenue would drop to less than 20 rupees. So it's very well settled in Delhi. And then I moved to Bombay because Kotak was merging the brokerage business with the wealth business. And I was representing Kotak with the McKinsey project while doing that. And that's when life changed for me. And I moved to Kotak Bombay mid 2006 and suddenly got exposed to this entire concept of multiple of profits as opposed to percentage of profits. And that's when the entrepreneurial bug kind of bit me the second time. And then I started doing the maths again. And on 100 rupee revenue earned for the firm, the broad maths was coming to 15 to 20 rupees to me, 15 to 20 rupees to the other people in the chain and the command and the entire product team and the branding, marketing, another 10 rupees of corporate costs. So the firm was left with around about 50 odd rupees on which the firm paid taxes, left with 30, 35 rupees post-tax. On my 15, 20, I paid taxes. I was left with 8 to 9 rupees post-tax. So effectively it was 8 rupees to 30 rupees equation, which I was absolutely at peace with because 1:4 seemed fair. What started kind of disturbing me in mid 2007 as the market started moving up was the fact that this 30 rupees got multiplied by 30 times and my 8 rupees remained at 8 rupees, right? So suddenly, and those days long-term capital gains tax was zero. So suddenly on 100 rupees revenue, the promoter was sitting on 900 rupees post-tax and I was sitting at 8 rupees post-tax. And that obviously was a 1:100 kind of equation as opposed to 1:4 kind of equation. And that started the seed in my mind to start looking at something entrepreneurial. So I think mid 2007 onwards, I became a little edgy. I was fidgety, wanted to do something different. I was not the head of the wealth business. I was just about became head of the Bombay office. So I was just kind of, it was really my first position of strength in that sense within Kotak. I did it all for 6 months because I was already a little edgy by then.
So your decision, let's move on to, how you basically started your journey, right? So if you think about it, you must have obviously thought about, okay, do I go and raise capital? Do I do this? Do I do that? But you ultimately decided you wanted to partner with some corporate house, right? And you found Nirmal. So my two questions over there, how did you determine, was that a kind of a short approach where you talk to 20 guys and one guy basically listened to you? And two, what was your elevator pitch to Nirmal?
So honestly, Dhanpal, it wasn't so scientific. I wish it was. It ended up being, more a matter of chance as opposed to a matter of, science and deep amount of thought. So my colleague Yatin essentially and Amit both were more on the capital market side, and therefore I guess appreciated the multiples of life much faster and better than I did. So basically Yatin and Amit had met Nirmal, and Nirmal was very keen to start something on the wealth side of the table. And Yatin came to me to office, and he basically met Nirmal and said, I can't do this alone. I'll have to get this colleague of mine, Karan, into the board. Otherwise, it's not something which we can kind of look at doing. He came to office and just told me, I want to meet you for a drink. There's 100 crore opportunity. So that was his pitch to me. I honestly thought that he wants to quit, and he had just started reporting into me that time. So I thought I'll go and have a drink with him. Pretty much kept my bosses in the loop, and went to meet him for a drink. And that's really when he opened it up. Quickly met Nirmal after that. Quick conversations for a couple of hours. Nirmal was very clinical about it. He exactly kind of told me what I wanted to hear in that sense, that the platform's available, ownership is available, and there are different ways of getting to the same point. And if you start out, I think I'll quote an example which he gave me, which kind of stayed with me in some senses. He said, if you start out on your own, absolutely on your own, in a financial services business, it's like going from ITC Parel to Nariman Point. And if you start off with capital and a bit of a platform and technology in place, you'll be kind of going on a cycle potentially, because you're owning less equity, but you'll be going on from JJ Flower. Cycle might be a bad example, from a bike, but you'll be going from JJ Flower. If you're going on your own, you might be in a Mercedes, but you'll be going below JJ, and you still end up taking an inordinate 2 or 3 times the amount of time, as opposed to having a professional back. And we went and looked back at our client base very honestly. And when we looked at our top 250 clients, and we thought about it, if we start out totally on our own, will we be able to get wallet share from these top 250 clients? And the answer was repeatedly coming out to be a strong no. And I think it seemed like the right mix, the 66-34. I think we had enough skin in the game. And honestly, we realized 10 years later, and especially when you look at all the startups now, that if you would have started on our own, most probably within 10 years, we would have got diluted to 34 anyway. And we would have had to raise a lot of capital on the way. So in retrospect, it worked out well, I think, because we really never had to spend too much time on the capital stack. We always had capital. We didn't have to dilute for the first 8 years. And that allowed us to maintain our equity, as opposed to kind of getting diluted multiple times.
Thanks, Karan. I think that was a great kind of but any thoughts on, was the founding team based something that you always knew you guys were working together and you always knew you'd work together?
Not really, Dhanpal. I think it was we had some comfort working with each other. A little bit of, I think the biggest point was it was commonality of objectives, right? So all of us wanted to get there. And
complementarity of skills?
Complementarity of skills was there for sure. I think we had worked with each other for a couple of years. And I think the biggest thing we had going for each other was trust, right? I think we were willing to give each other space to do what they wanted to do. And I think that was the entire DNA of the entire team. Not only the 3 of us, but the entire team which left together, around about 10 of us. And after that, actually never recruited from Kotak. So after the first 10, we never ended up recruiting from Kotak ever again. But in that sense, we were able to attract the right set of people, and we were able to kind of give them a lot of responsibility. And I think that's really worked well for us. And even today, if I was to think back, I can only think of the fact that we trusted each other, and we gave each other some space. And most importantly, we had one single interest in mind. So I think that's really what's kind of worked for us.
One of the things, again, if I now fast forward and if I look at your kind of 10-12-year journey now with IIFL Wealth, one thing which is very remarkable is that you've always shown a propensity to kind of, at least in hindsight, seem to be one step ahead of the market, right? You've gone from being a pure, I would say, distribution shop to basically building an advisory shop, to building capabilities around the trust side, to eventually then with the capital that GA and some of the other guys brought in, you built an NBFC and almost created a prime broking type product, which India never had really, right? From a classic perspective. And all of this, I mean, if you think about it, these seem to be like, very well thought through. If you look at any kind of global wealth model, it seems that you've kind of done on those lines. But is this, how would you classify it? When you started out, did you know that you were going to do all these things? Were there major pivots that you saw? And how would you think that you kind of stayed one step ahead of the market every time?
I think honestly, Dhanpal, if I think about it, it's just having the ability or the courage to do what is right. I think we all know it. It's just about accepting it and doing it. For example, the entire advisory business, I remember, Merrill made the change in the year 2008, 2007. They started from 2006. We had McKinsey advise us in Kotak in 2007, saying you should start making the pitch. And I remember, all of us agreeing with it, then finally not going ahead with it in late 2007 because we said, 80% of our clients or 20% of our clients, which make up 80% of our revenues, will actually fall in revenues nearly by half if you make the transition at that point in time. Cycle back to all the way forward to 2017-18, we had the same set of issues, right? So it was still the right thing to do, but still you had to sacrifice half the revenues to be able to make the transition. Compulsions remain the same. We were going to get listed in a year. It's just about kind of at some point, you have to recognize if you don't do it, you won't remain relevant. And I think the only reason we've been able to do it is we've been true to ourselves. I think as leaders and people in the industry and in the business, we all see it, but we're just not willing to kind of accept it and want to go ahead with the status quo as long as possible. So I think that's what I think we've been true to ourselves to say, this is going to change, whether we like it or not, and we're not going to be larger than the industry. So I think that's something which is important. And secondly, I think we've always believed the client's extremely smart, and I think the fact is, all the clients we're dealing with are wealth creators in multiple magnitudes. And I think if we can't keep our platform 100% complete, whether it's as a prime broker, whether it's as an NBFC, the client will see the difference very, very sharply. And we love to call it it's not an additive function, but a multiplicative function, right? So even if you're missing one smallest part in the platform, it kind of doesn't remain 9 plus 9 plus 9. It becomes 9 into 9 into 9. And if 9 becomes 0, that platform can't succeed at all. And even if one part becomes 8, the percentage gap between the two platforms kind of increases by a multiplicative effect. So I think the ability to keep the platform extremely, extremely complete is very, very important from our client perspective. And therefore, we've kind of invested in all the different parts you've kind of said. And the third part, which I think is the most critical part to these two, is the culture, right? So I think that's something which is really, really important. And if I was to look back at the last 10 years and think of one critical part, and I don't know how to describe it because there's no better way to describe it or no good way to describe it, is the culture, right? So it's an open culture. There is a 24/7 kind of reaction time to every request of the client. We have to kind of ensure that we are working for the interest of the client, and that has to kind of get expressed in all ways possible. It doesn't mean every investment decision is going to be right, because that's not possible. But if you study hard enough and work towards an intent to make it right, you'll at least get 8 out of 10 right. And that's really where the key is. And I think that's what we've done, and that's led to a very small quantum of client attrition and employee attrition, which kind of then gets repeated in culture in many ways. So that's really what I would put as 3 elements.
No, I think you've made some 2 very, very excellent points. I think one is very clearly keeping the client at the center of your universe. And, so you feel that this is a business which has tried to stay Steve Jobs is famous for basically saying, I'll create a product and the clients will want it. Do you feel that that's what you guys are trying to do in this space? Or is it a situation that you're listening to your client and basically creating products which meet their real needs rather than basically something that they want?
So I think in our business we can't invent anything, because unlike Steve Jobs obviously is a phenomenally different guy, and they have invented a lot of stuff also. I think we are more innovators. We are not really inventors in that sense. So we are able to understand and discern what the client wants and repackage something. And those quirks could be very different, right? The quirk could be timing, it could be pricing, it could be tax. It could be it could be a lot of things. In retrospect, it always seems simple, but the ability to have a first mover advantage is very critical. But the business is really not about products. I think what we've done with products is really used it as a entry tool, because it's what gives us access to the client. Most clients find it very difficult to buy service on day one. So they're not able to necessarily, for good or for bad, discern that one advisor can advise better than the other advisor, right? So on day zero, they get attracted to the product, and then really it's up to the platform of how to kind of try and convert that client from being a product-driven client to an advisory client. And I think unless and until you're able to make that shift, it's extremely difficult to scale, because products, hope you get 80% right, but you can get them wrong also. And if you make it a product-oriented firm, you run the risk of not having a standardized kind of offering and standardized appreciation from most of your clients. So I think the ability to shift from a product to a service-based offering is something which is very, very critical, especially in a business like ours.
So if we now look at, where you are today, and I think the COVID aspect clearly is, I'm sure playing itself into the way you look at your business going forward. But one of the biggest dangers of successful businesses is what I call strategy drift, right? The term strategy drift basically means that you feel you're successful at something, that you can get into something else, and that's going to be equally successful. Right. Have you, one, experienced that in your last 10, 12 years? Have you had to course correct as a result of that? Do you feel you are yet very true to what your strategy has been? And if I were to kind of now, look forward and say, IIFL Wealth of 2020 and IIFL Wealth of 2030, right? Do you have a perspective of what you think you will be?
Yeah. So I think if I look back for the last 10 years, it's not as if we didn't have to course correct. I think one of the biggest investments and mistakes we made was trying to kind of get hold of the NRI markets by opening offshore offices in the US, UK, Dubai, Singapore, and so on and so forth, right? I wish I would have opened offices in Rajkot, Surat, Indore 10 years back. Each of them would be 10 times larger than our London office today, right? So in that sense, a huge amount of capital invested, but really not with the same set of results. And we realized that the same set of unique advantages we had in India, which is having the best platform to service our clients, we didn't have in these offices. And, irrespective of the same culture and the same service levels, if you didn't have the platform to execute, the client was not really going to do business with you. So in that sense, I think that's a course we corrected 3.5 years back. And we're seeing correspondingly great benefits in, for the lack of a better word, in the tier 2 or the tier 3 cities. And I think that's going to be an aspect which is going to be fairly important as we go ahead. I think from a focus perspective, we are very, very clear. I think that's an area of strength for us. The only thing we ever want to do is money management. We really don't want to do anything else. And within money management is obviously wealth and asset management. That's what we understand. We have a very strong commercial DNA in the firm, and we want to use that to the best. So we're very sure that we don't want to shift our strategy in any different way. What we've also stayed away is from the temptation of getting into the priority of the mass affluent business, which is essentially for the lack of a better say, there's no science to this number, but essentially 2 to 10 crores, which is potentially the largest target segment market in India. We've kind of stayed away from it because the cost of acquisition there is fairly high, and banks are doing, banks end up being the port of first call for that segment. So I think, IIFL in 2030, I think we'll continue to do these two things. But within these two things, there are a lot of areas we haven't explored. So we want to kind of figure out how we can break the distribution, traditional distribution matrices, let's say in the conventional mutual fund industry, or even in the 2 to 10 crore affluent segment, and potentially use technology and some bit of digital interventions to be able to use our brand and products to reach out to these segment of clients, as opposed to staying only with large high net worth individuals and family offices. So today both our product, the asset management side, which is alternate assets, as well as our wealth offerings, are focused on a niche set of clients. We would love to see how we can kind of reach out to the larger pool of clients, but it has to be backed by a very strong innovation shift on the distribution side.
Very interesting. Yeah. Look, I think let's shift gears now. We have a few minutes. I wanted to kind of spend time a little bit talking about what your current perspective of, as a business leader running a fairly volatile business in a marketplace where currently we are, faced with all kinds of uncertainties and challenges. Uh, if you were to sit at the ground level and look at it from a pure, professional who's trying to become an entrepreneur, a startup who is trying to basically build a business, and if you were to say that, look, these are the 2, 3 things that you would have as an advice, right, or inputs, how would you want them to look at the world, the macro, from their perspective? And what are the 2, 3 things that you would advise them to do?
So I think let me start by saying the best things happen in life when you start something in adversity, right? So I think I started Kotak way back in 2001 in the most adverse situations. But then the expectations are so low that you can only grow from there. When we started IIFL Wealth, we started in April 2008, which was bang in the middle of the financial crisis. Both the occasions we couldn't have got the timing more wrong than what we did. But there was a certain sense of modesty when we started out that time, and the budgets, the spendings, the expectations of what you could do from yourself were very, very different. And I think that's a great strength. And when you start off in times like this, your mind always kind of keeps you grounded and modest about what you can do. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths we all can have as an entrepreneur who's starting up. The second quick advice, I'm a strong believer in a 60-30-10 formula. So 60% is obviously going to be about the sector. It's very, very important to get your sector right. You could be pretty much God, but if you got the sector wrong, you can't change it all. Imagine if I had started a brokerage business in 2008 instead of the wealth management business. Brokerage went through got killed between 2008 to 16. And irrespective of whether you were, Amitabh Bachchan, you couldn't do much in that industry, right? So you have to get the sector right. Very important to be able to choose a sector which is going to kind of scale up and grow over the next 10 years. 30% is the platform. Okay, then it's not necessary that you have to have a professional platform backing you, but you have to have the platform to be able to get the consumer, because he's extremely discerning irrespective of which bracket he belongs. And the last 10% is effort, right? Because even if you look at IIFL Wealth, the first 90% is common to every employee. Finally, the last 10% is what makes the distinction, and that's the effort. And I think all of us have to put in tremendous amount of effort, and the last 10% makes all the difference. So I think the sector, industry, the platform, and finally, it's going to be, all our jobs are fairly laborious in nature. So the last 10% still has to be kind of done. I wouldn't worry much about the volatility. I think that's fine. That'll come and go. I think over the last 30, 40 years, we've seen enough of it. And, I had a webinar with a great revered investor of ours, Prem Vatsa, and he said, this too will pass in some ways. So I think that's really, that's my take on volatility. This too will pass. But I think we'll have to kind of be a little more grounded and be focused on the deliverables.
Great. I'm just going to take a pause and see if people really have any questions. Are we opening it up now? Yeah, okay. I'm seeing a few which are coming through. I think we've answered one already. 2 is already answered. Okay, so maybe then I'll continue with maybe a couple of more questions that I have. If you think about it from a investment perspective, what are your, okay, before I get to that, let's talk about your thought process on digital, right? And we've looked at financial services broadly, your business, wealth and money management, I would say more specifically. There is this massive fear that fintech at one point in time would disrupt everything. Then you suddenly saw, clearly the incumbents starting to build very, very strong moats on their own businesses and building fintech capabilities. So do you have a point of view that can legacy businesses become strong fintech businesses and deliver digital solutions to clients or make customers digitally, responsive to their solutions? Or do you think that you need to basically completely recreate the organizational flow, culture, thought process and completely turn it on its head to become a digitally native business? And how important is that?
So I think three quick comments. I think what's happened on the digital fintech space is, I think the behavioral pattern of consumers has changed differently. At least on the large high ticket clients, we've not seen clients actually go online and necessarily execute all transactions themselves. What, however, has changed is their expectation on the analytic, on the ability to capture communication, on the kind of reporting that has changed massively. But they still continue to, in terms of decision making, be fairly high touch in nature. And I think that's not changed globally. That's something which is taking a little longer to change. But what's happening is the pipe is continuously improving. And eventually that will have an impact on pricing. And even if the client behavior and the execution side doesn't necessarily change, all of our firms will have to become extremely digitally efficient to be able to deliver the client in a competitive manner. On the more mass customized, non-customized solutions, I think quicker than earlier, and I think in some senses COVID will accelerate it. I think a lot of the platforms will be forced to become digital. I think what Vanguard did in the US, you will see have three or four large players in India do it fairly quickly. The asset management industry is ripe for disruption. Even the wealth management industry, if you look at the retail space, it's already seeing a massive amount of metamorphosis. Can existing firms do it? I think more often than not, no. Okay, I don't want to be. I think that's what my feeling is. I think culture is extremely critical, and I've tried to interact with a few of these guys who set up the fintech firms, and they're different. They think differently. They have a phenomenal engineering DNA to themselves. They have a very different orientation to the client, and they have a very different orientation to the platform. In an ideal world, I think if we can mix our understanding of the client, our DNA, and their knowledge of how processes will get optimized, I think it could throw out the best. But I think it's more difficult than it sounds. So I would put 80% of the organizations which are currently physical, trying to be digital, unlikely to be able to be the new firms which will necessarily be the winners in fintech. I think you'll see newer firms come around. Ideally, selfishly, I would like to believe we could do it, but if you ask me, I think with an 80% probability, the answer is no.
That's great. I think I got a ton of questions coming out of that. Let me just throw the few at you. I think your views on robo-advisory, your views on consolidation in the whole financial services and maybe specifically in your space, and your views on, maybe if you can just respond to those two first, then I'll ask the others.
So I think, as I said earlier, I think the robo-advisory and the fintech space, I think ripe for disruption. The only problem is the only way to monetize these businesses is either doing broker transaction activities or providing solutions on the asset management side, right? So in India, it's really difficult to get clients to pay for advice or necessarily, get clients to come and pay subscriptions for research. So both of those business models will take a long period of time. So the ability to invest capital and build a moat around that is extremely difficult. And eventually, most of the larger robo-advisory firms are either headed towards becoming brokers or in turn kind of becoming solution-oriented asset management companies. And I think that's really where the world's still not figured it out, how to monetize these business models. But yeah, will you get a lot of clients to kind of sign up? The answer is yes. But I think eventually, I think 2 or 3 of these robo-advisors
Karan, this is a very highly regulated industry, right? And if you look at every day, the regulators are working on new ways to basically reduce the spreads of what they think basically is the skim in the game, right? That advisors, brokers, mutual fund, asset management companies, banks, every sort of financial intermediation is being looked at even more acutely. And whether it's the RBI, whether it's SEBI, whether it's IRDA, they're all looking at ways and means to reduce and shrink, right? The kind of, I would say, the costs of doing business. And how are you kind of, looking at this? Is this a healthy evolution? Is this killing competition? Because we look at it from a startup's perspective, right? They're saying basically we have just not enough margin to be able to go and build a business in a space. Whereas you look at it from an incumbent's perspective, they say that's great because it's making it even more difficult for new guys to come in and compete here. So is there a level at which you start thinking that there needs to be healthy competition and there need to be every disruptor for every incumbent?
So I'm on the other side. So as an incumbent,
Yeah. So you were a startup, now you're an incumbent. So how do you feel about?
if I was to just think about 2008, and if you had the current regulatory guidelines, I think we would need close to 10 times the capital or 20 times the capital we actually started off with, because it's just so difficult to start. But having said that, I think some of the regulations in India are way ahead of their time and not necessarily reflecting the maturity of the market. They're good regulations. If you ask me, they're definitely honest and they definitely need to come through. But for example, the advisory regulations, we are more or less close to where UK is. And UK is seen a huge amount of consolidation and a huge amount of aggregation. I'm not sure if India is still there, but I think the regulator is very, very keen to head towards that. And unfortunately, when we're talking today, all regulations come into effect 1st October. So effectively, you're not even 10 to 15 days away. So it's not really a matter of debate. It's a matter of the fact that it's already happened. So the only fee the regulator really wants you to charge over a longer period of time is one which the client is agreeing to pay you. And they really want to cut out all the other aspects of disintermediation in that sense. I think that's a given. All of us will have to build our business models either on earning a transaction fee or charging the client a fee or a subscription model. I don't think so there is any fourth revenue line item there, which the regulator is going to allow for the longer term time period.
Okay. I've got multiple questions coming up on team building. I think, as you know, most businesses as they grow, big challenges in attracting, then big challenges in retaining. Attrition tends to be kind of depending on businesses high. And then finally, I would say, how do you pick people? How do you choose team members? How do you retain them? What's been your experience, learnings, and what are the 2-3 pitfalls that you think people should avoid? Or what are the 2-3 things that you as a leader focus on to make sure that you have your right people and they stay with you?
Then, to a certain extent, it's different in every business. But for example, in our business, I think the 2 qualities which we look for in every relationship manager, which is extremely important, is a strong commercial understanding. And commercial understanding doesn't mean he has to be super good in maths, but he has to enjoy money a little bit, right? So he has to enjoy the fact that he's dealing with money. He typically likes, in his childhood, like to do tables, like to multiply 8 by 8 or 10 by 10. Doesn't need to do complex derivatives, but at least needs to like numbers. And secondly, I think hard work scores over everything else. And third is, is an organization's person and can be trusted, right? So I don't think so. We look for the best person out there because it's possible we'll end up at the 80th percentile or the 85th percentile. But with these 2-3 qualities, he's more sustainable and much more productive in the longer term, rather than having an extremely sharpshooter who's kind of distracted every day with different set of things. So I think the other thing really which is there in every employee's life cycle is at different stages, and that's where the challenge comes in. Initial stages, it's obviously a lot more about compensation and money. Towards the middle stage, it becomes about getting responsibilities and roles and designations within the firm. And as the person crosses 10 years with you, money as well as roles become less important, and that becomes a fact of life because you already have it. So in some senses, you kind of take it for granted, and then you start off searching for an entrepreneurial kind of bug in you. I think that's where the biggest challenge is, to be able to create an environment where the person feels empowered enough that he's able to kind of saturate his entrepreneurial bug within the organization. And I think that's really what organizations like us need to ensure is there every year. and without getting into too many new businesses within the current business created environment where each employee is being able to become a bit of an entrepreneur without actually having to look out and without having the same need for money and designations as he had 5 or 10 years back.
Karan, I've got a specific question on your services.
Right.
One of the viewers is asking whether you're going to offer cryptocurrency as an option for investors. And this is coming from my dear friend Pradeep Udas.
Yeah.
Pradeep, I don't know whether you have, you obviously have a very diverse portfolio. You may want to add some crypto, but what's your view? Are you going to offer that service?
We're lucky enough to have an account from Pradeep also. But no, I think, unfortunately, we stay in a very, very regulated market. And unless and until we see a fairly large regulated track record for any instrument, we end up not being able to offer it. And therefore, to be honest, not really being able to study cryptocurrency in a phenomenal way because it's not something which has really been in our domain. But I'm sure once it gets regulated and approved by most countries in the world, at some point it'll find its way to India. But I don't think it's happening in a haste.
Karan, we are already at the allotted time to wrap up the seminar. What's your availability? Do you have time for a few more questions?
Yes, absolutely. No problem at all.
Okay, great. So maybe let me just move. I have a couple of things. I think you've been an angel investor. Can we talk about that for a few minutes? You've made some investments. What's your philosophy? How do you think about, are these like, friends who've kind of approached you and you've just given them some money, or do you have a slightly more scientific approach to actually making a portfolio of angel investments?
I wish I had Dhanpal. I think I missed out a large part of the last 10-year angel investment story, but it was partly because of three things. I think I have a view on angel investing, but I missed out quite a bit because I think initially I was a disbeliever, to be fair, 10 to 15 years back. I think I changed 5, 6 years back. But to start off, I was a much more traditional, conventional wisdom guy. Secondly, I think we raised a lot of early stage funds ourselves and a lot of mid stage funds. So we end up being conflicted pretty much in most of our investments. So therefore, never really had the chance to go out and do it individually. And third, I've done a lot of co-investments with our seed funds, and I think the experience has been great. I think overall, I think the two things which have worked again is obviously the management, and that's a very kind of a rustic and overdone word. But I think the ability to deliver, have a aspiration to become large and give quality offering to the client is something which kind of stays common across. And second, I think
you want to talk through one or two examples. You've got Wow Tables, Kids Top Press, Gourmet Up. Just give us one kind of war story here. What you liked, what happened.
One good example which we have and one bad example in that sense. I think so. Wow Tables, I think, kind of wound up 2 or 3 years after I invested, but honestly wasn't involved much in the business. But again, basically was trying to individualize and customize restaurant bookings, but really couldn't build the technology to scale. And was kind of modeled more on OpenTable on the US, but was not able to get into the reservation network of restaurants like OpenTable was able to do. I remember going down to New York for a lot of the diligence meetings with GA, and I was fascinated with the concept of OpenTable, and that's really what got me to invest in Wow. On the other hand, we invested in a company called Unifor, which was essentially a voice transcription company, which has done extremely well. And I think the metamorphosis for that company was essentially John Chambers coming on board and really kind of moving the company from an India domiciled company to a US domiciled company. And that kind of really changed again, the size of the market and the scale of the market and the ability of a lot of clients to be able to customize the product. So sometimes, I think what I've discovered is the ecosystem in the startup world is more important than anything else. And the ability of 3 or 4 rainmakers in that sense to be able to associate with that company and get them the right contacts and ecosystems, the most important. Unfortunately, I've not been able to play that role and don't see myself doing that in a big hurry. As long as I'm active in this business, it kind of doesn't allow me the luxury or the time to do it. But if at all, at some point, post my career here, that's something I would definitely kind of want to do.
Super. Um, as a person, you've always been self-motivated. You always seem to be very passionate. You always seem to be kind of on top. But other times where you just want to kind of throw it up and say, look, and how do you then recover from that and get back to really driving yourself, loving what you do? And I know I've heard your colleagues talk about you responding to WhatsApp messages at 2 a.m. in the morning and 4 a.m. in the morning, right?
Many times, we
Yeah.
all go through that phase. I think depending on your age, it increases more and more. I think, but definitely once in 2-3 weeks, you feel like what are you doing, and what are you doing it for? But I think at the heart of it, Dhanpal, when you get up in the morning, this is what you like to do. And honestly, on a 24/7 basis, I can't imagine myself doing anything else. And it's nowhere to a point saying you're frustrated with what you want, you love what you want to do. Obviously, I think the intensity kind of gets to you at different points in time. I'm fairly young. I'm still 44, 40, 43, 44. Got a long runway ahead. And honestly, I think for the next 5 to 6 years at least, can't imagine myself doing anything different there.
Super. Just one more question and then we'll wrap it up. There's a question on neobanks. Do you have a point of view on all digital banks versus a hybrid model versus, just what the banking system is doing?
No, I think digital banks and new banks will definitely get a lot of attraction. But I think the only contrary thought to that is interest rates have to go lower for digital banks really to kind of become extremely successful. Because one of the main revenue lines for banks is a huge arbitrage on the savings account and current account interest. So even today on current accounts, banks pay zero interest to the customer, and that's a huge revenue line item. And unless and until that doesn't go away, I think there will be enough steam with all the old banks to be able to build large physical retail distribution outlets. Once the current account, savings account revenue line becomes substantially smaller, I think you'll see a very different distribution network emerge out of banks, and that's something which is happening across the world. But I think in India, you still need a decade or so for interest rates to kind of become really low, or RBI kind of liberalizes the current account interest rate regime also, like they did for savings account, and that could be a moment where the physical location of banks versus the ability to kind of service digitally gets questioned in a massive way.
Karan, thanks a lot. I just want to kind of summarize what we heard from you and some of the nuggets I take away personally. I think first and foremost is I think it reminds me of Winston Churchill's kind of success motto, right? He said that success is a series of failure after failure, which you pursue with the same level of enthusiasm. And that's really interesting, right? Because, what people see is the 1% success, but not the 99% challenges which you went through to get to that space. I think your journey clearly also proves that this is something that you've articulated, and what seems to be very clear is there's a very, very clear focus that you need to have through whatever you do as a business. This is something that you've kept to your core, you've focused on it, and you made sure that you continue to deliver and keep improving the service that you have. Third, you talked about team culture. I think that clearly resonates. The whole part about being able to motivate people, get them to work with you, and then basically to get them to become, like you said, entrepreneurs in their own right within the business as they feel it's their own. That's something that completely, I think most, successful entrepreneurs will echo, that if they have a kind of a firm full of, strong participants who are completely wedded to the philosophy and the passion and the vision, I think you will see that end up in the results that you make. And then finally, I think it's interesting that you share this perspective on the way you talked about, the new and the old, right? Whether it's digital or not, and acknowledging that not everything is perfect. You've got to live with what sometimes you're not a perfect person, but with that imperfection, how do you find the right kind of, answers for you? Because we will not all be perfect in our life, and we have to find those right answers for us. So it's been great talking to you. Like always, I learned something from you, and Thank you for spending this time with us.
Thanks, Mr. Nishar. Thanks, Naveen.
So thanks a lot, Karan. Thanks a lot, Dhanpal. This was an outstanding session. So wonderful. And appreciate Karan for being so candid and so frank and honest about your career. This was really wonderful to know all that.
Thank you.
And how lightly you can put the whole struggle. That is what really impresses me. So that makes me learn that, look, I should not make too much out of struggle if I have to do that any time in life, you know.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Everybody.
Wonderful
And thank you to all the participants, sir.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.